First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I understand also the situation where the only thing that separates you from lunch. So we'll hold the line, but probably we'll try to certainly. We'll not be able to hold it for too long. First of all, whatever questions are coming, I think the main question that underlines many of them is about what I, as a historian, was doing writing the history of the war that just started and was going on, and we don't know when it will come to an end. And that was the question that I asked myself many times. I eventually came up with a formula that justified what I was doing and what I am doing. I rephrased Winston Churchill, who said that democracy was the worst form of government except every other form. And I patented the phrase that historians are the worst commentators on contemporary developments except everybody else. So that is my excuse. Another excuse is that the subtitle of the book is The Return of History. So I just put for the searches, computer searches, history in the title. And this is not dig at Francis Fukuyama. I basically think that he is much more right on many things that we give him credit for, including, especially when it comes to Eastern Europe. That's where his official article was. But it's more a reference to my personal belief that we are back in many ways to this sort of history, and the closest parallels that we can find with today are not in the history of the last 30 years, not in the history of since 1989, but in the history of the Cold War, and very often in the history of the Second World War, World War II. So that's what I had in mind with this subtitle. And that provided me also with a particular sort of legitimacy as a historian venturing into contemporary developments. The invitation came directly from Mr. Putin, who was certainly writing and publishing on history. It was abuse, misuse of history, and one way or another, there was certainly pressure on historians to respond in one way or another. So I really can't remember in reading on any sort of war in the world where there would be so much history around it from the start go, from the very beginning in terms of justification of unjustifiable. I just don't remember another war that would start with a long article attributed to the leader who started this war. So there was that opening, there was that invitation, and I took advantage of it. So good part of the book is also trying to talk about history. I started early on. In first chapter, I look at the fall of the empire as a long delay process. This is the major framework that I'm using to also to understand this war. I'm also talking about different ideologies that were associated, in particular on the Russian side, with the justification of the war, from the ideas of the imperial model of the Russian nation, existing of a number of sub-nations, for the lack of better words. So that's where the idea of Russians and Ukrainians are coming from, to the ideas of Eurasianism and Greater Russia and others. Also do something that normally is expected from historians, is to look at the immediate origins of the war. So the way how we got where we are today. I do something that historians have been doing since the time of chronicler writing, and this is just trying to create a chronology. It's amazing how many issues can become clear, or at least clearer, when you use chronology, and when you find out that actually a certain event happened before the other event, and that maybe there is a connection between the two. And this chronology is lost not only in the work of political scientists, anthropologists, in the work of historians as well. We neglect chronology, so that is the first draft of history is extremely important one. And then I got involved into something that is maybe even more problematic than everything that I discussed before, predicting the future. And that is the sort of questions that for everyone probably in this room was in the situation more than once, when the media asks you, and the question is always about the future. And I had to answer this question even without this journalistic sort of interest or pushing me into that direction. Because when you write about certain particular developments today as they unfold, one thing that I learned, and it was a painful process of learning that, is something that you considered absolutely important, paramount today. Somehow the developments of tomorrow and the day after tomorrow turned it at the best into the footnote. And so you try already to make and guess which development is important, which is the turning one. Or in other words, is which one is a historic, right? Even on a small scale. And what I was trying to do is to look at the impact of the war, the first year of the war. That is what is covered in the book, on this long array processes that I was discussing before, and make an educated guess to what degree this is a change, to what degree this is a change that will last. This is true for developments in Ukraine, for the developments of Russo-Ukrainian relations, and also in my last two chapters, I look at the international context and the way how it had been changed already by the developments of the war, and then making I hope, an educated guess that these changes would last. So that is where I applied my lenses as a historian, my training as a historian, and experience that I had and have as a historian to write about things that didn't come to an end. The historians write about processes that came to an end. We know the answer to the puzzle that people are try to solve today, and then from that answer we are going back, and that's how we are so wise. That's how we have this all insights. Here you don't know the answer, right? And it is a challenge. I'm happy to talk about that challenge, and it's still with me. It's still with us today. So thank you very much for inviting, for having this discussion.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I love how you actually just started with my first question, which really was about what it's like to be a historian writing about the present. And I think you just articulated the skills of a historian that help you do that, right? Attention to chronology, attention to thinking about sources, um, uh, but I wonder if you can expand a little bit more on the sort of practices of a historian that helped you actually pull together in the really second part of the book all of those sources that were happening today, right? And kind of how you weeded through all of the sources that must have been happening in the days when you were actually writing the book, right? To sort of feel through how can I put together a chronology of the war that will not become a footnote, right? And that is an accurate chronology of the war as it is unfolding, because it isn't what we do as historians. We're really used to looking at things that are kind of, the book is closed on them, and we're reevaluating them and rethinking them, right? And you are dealing with writing something that is really unfolding in the present, and that is when the ground is changing under you. So I guess I really want to kind of, beyond the really funny line of no better to do it than a historian, And really, how did you do that? How did you put together this chronology of the war?
It wasn't a funny line. I'm kidding. Well, it's an excellent question, and I don't think I even once mentioned sources in my opening remarks, but this is extremely important. This is key, and one of those things is that it's a different type also of sources that you use in the conditions of this war, the documented maybe war. So there are of course there is YouTube, there is TikTok, there is Twitter, whatever the name of Twitter will be in the future. It is still Twitter. So all of these sources that basically we were not trained to work with.
No, not at all.
Yeah? So you try to figure out what to do with that. Another thing is, and I learned that first while writing a book on the assassination of Bandera, that it's not just that we don't know certain things and we don't have the sources, but there are institutions that on purpose actually create fake news, for the lack of a better word. So today it is called IPSO, right? And it comes from both sides. This is the war. And that's additional challenge, not just to get to the quote unquote truth with the minimum sources or very few sources that come in, but also specifically deal with disinformation that is being created and happening in real time. And you really don't have this another 20, 30 years to create other sources to compare that to interrogate them. And you have to make this decisions on the spot. And it has been roughly half of a year since the book was published. It has been probably a year since I introduced any major changes there or corrections. And for the paper book, I introduced a lot of corrections, but they were basically about me maybe more about technical issues that I didn't get right or overlooked. So far, I didn't find any substantial things where I had to change, which is a little bit comforting. So maybe something I was doing right. And the general approach, I never formulated it for myself. I'm just trying to do this now in response to your question, is that the approach is still the same that we use with any period, with any sources. You compare them to other things, right? And if it sounds right and sounds right to you in the context of other sources that you know about, then probably, and it is important enough for your argument, then you can use it and hopefully look for corroborating sources as well. So it's the method is the same. It's just that you don't have time and you work under the time pressure because you write now about now.
Yeah, and that uncertainty too.
It is uncertainty. It certainly adds to anxiety.
Yeah. On the time issue, you were a guest at this seminar a year or two before COVID to present one of your earlier books, The Gates of Europe. And by the time you made it to the seminar, you actually had a copy of the new book, The Assassination of Bandera. So we at least...
flights very often leave late, arrive late, so... So things happen, traveling from one conference to another.
So I guess I'm going to ask you the same question we asked you then. We are amazed by the fact that you are so prolific, but producing high-quality books, obviously including this one. It's almost a book every 2 years or a year and a half, or in the case of the Gates of Europe Bandera, I think it was within a year. But 2022, with this enormous pressure, and also emotional pressure, you do talk about your sister at the beginning of the book, who was in Zaporizhia, I believe, or Dnipro, yeah. So when the bombs were falling. And I don't think you're in permanent sabbatical. You direct an institute and you're fairly active in the media with all these interviews, and yet you're able to, I'm talking about the second part of the book, the first draft of the 2022 invasion, you're able to do something, and that's quite remarkable under a very limited time span. So how do you do it?
Well, as I said, the planes sometimes leave late and arrive late. You have time in the airport that you should use. But generally, again, I didn't have good answer to this question back then. I don't have it now. But with this particular book is that it actually helped me to go through the first year of the war. Because somehow I convinced myself not only that historians can do that, but allegedly I was doing something important. Allegedly I was doing something important that actually can have an impact, right? And probably all of us were in the situation during this last year and a half where we wanted to do something important and to have an impact. And then the rest probably depends on how, I don't know, impressible is the right term or not, whether you can convince yourself that you're doing something of that sort. So that's on the one hand, it's very difficult. It's a pressure. It's you do what you're not trained to do. On the other hand, you also think that this is something that hopefully will have some impact.
So I want to ask you something that's maybe a little bit off topic, but related, which is that you started your career very much as an early modern historian, right, working on Cossacks, and then you brought in Khrushchevsky, but your last few books have really been on the Soviet period. And as a Soviet historian, I want to ask you, how have your thoughts on Soviet history changed, or have they changed? And maybe on a sort of second question is, have your thoughts on any of your previous books changed? Right? Are there things that you would change now, knowing what you know now that you didn't know then?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I started as early modern historian. I still have interests in the field and unfinished projects. And partially, I became a historian of quote unquote Soviet historian because I was there, right? I remember certain things. I have sort of insight that others don't have. Again, that can be perceived also to be an obstacle, but it's also an insight, and that provided me with angle, with edge that maybe others didn't have, and I also thought as we were moving further and further away from 1991, I was realizing that actually fewer and fewer people have that sort of insight. So it had to be somehow recorded. And with the in terms of the change on works that I was writing, and specifically on the 20th century. With this war, I started to realize certain things that I didn't realize when I was writing on people like Grushevsky, when I was writing on work of historians of the immigration, post-World War II immigration. I was engaging directly or indirectly with them, with their ideas on the intellectual level. And somewhere in the background, there was a situation that, okay, the guy started writing something in Kiev, then was continuing writing that in the DP camps, and then ended up writing in the United States. But that was a sort of background that I had to provide as a good historian. I had to do that. But I didn't have this emotional feeling of what it might be. What is the refugee experience is about? What is the experience of surviving under the bombs is? So that emotional part of the history of specific individuals that I was thinking about when I was writing this book, but also about the era as a whole, the 20th century as a whole, that came to me as a discovery as the result of this war. So would I change anything? Probably not, because I also don't know how to turn this discovery into the books that I am writing or the works that I will be writing in the future. So I'm not prepared yet to say that I would change anything. But certainly my understanding changed. Certain things that you read about before but really didn't feel on that level come to the fore. We all read about the Red Army and the disrespect for human life, including the Red Army soldiers and officers. Now you sort of feel that, you understand that. We all read about the World War II and occupation, German and Nazi and then Soviet. And again, at least I personally engaged with that, tried to be a good historian, looked at different perspectives and sources, but it was intellectual engagement. Now there is the sense of understanding of that was not there before. Again, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to translate that into the words, into the text, into the different approaches. But I'm in a different place of the 20th. As a historian of the 20th century, I'm in a different place in the context of this war than I was before.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much. I would say I feel very similarly that reading sources that I've read a million times, and I read them differently now, and I think, how could I not have seen that? How could I not have imagined that? And I think there's a larger question of the role of the emotion of the researcher too, and what we do with that, I don't know. But thank you for your answer.
You mentioned famous or infamous essay by Putin 6 months before the invasion, noting that it's most unusual to have like an alleged almost seminar essay prefacing a war of aggression. When it came out, I remember thinking, even saying to my colleagues, I don't need to read this. And Serhii, in a sense that I know what's in it. And Serhii Plokhy or Frank Sisson or others can probably predict from A to Z what's in it, because it's taken from classic Russian nationalist texts. So you do mention the book from Uvarov, Ustryalov in the 19th century, Denikin in his memoirs after the Civil War, Solzhenitsyn as late as 1998. But you do say Putin's contribution to the imperial historical schemas was the notion of Ukraine as anti-Russia. So there was a contribution. You want to tell us what was it?
Yes, there was a contribution. Again, maybe I saw that a book was published also on ideology in the US, so it will be interesting of Russian ideology in particular of this war. It will be Marlene, it seems to me, yeah. So
who?
Marlene Laruelle.
Yeah.
Marlene Laruelle.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I look forward to reading this book, but also a little bit terrified. Maybe there's something that they found that I didn't see. So, that's what certainly was not in Uvarov for sure. That's also was not even in Solzhenitsyn, who served really as a transmission belt, as a bridge between the Russian imperial thinking and Putin's thinking. And I stated at some point for the first time in Kiev earlier this month that I see this fingerprints of Solzhenitsyn all over the ideology of this war. And so I didn't see it in other places. So anti-Russia is there, and that reminded me that I'm going back now to my origins as a historian of the 17th century. That reminds me about the discourse around the Union, where from the Orthodox side, the Union was perceived not as a legitimate religion or anything, but it was perceived as a specific intrigue of Rome, specific intrigue of the Catholic Church against the Orthodox. So that brings me back to the era of religious wars, intolerance, Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and the justification of killing on the other side on the basis of a particular faith. Where I basically, rereading this essay already after the start of the war, what I also found there very interesting, and it is in the book, he basically says there what upsets him also about recent developments in Ukraine, and what it looks like that's an admission what became the trigger for that. Because there is one paragraph where he says that roughly that the evil West introduced in Ukraine this awful system, he doesn't use word democracy, it seems to me, where the leaders change, but the position actually continues. And then without naming Zelensky by name, he says, okay, the recent leader of this and that, he was promising this. And he takes again the same trend. And you feel the frustration of, now I will not mention his name, the president of Russia, with this thing called democracy, right? It's very difficult. You just can't go there, find Yanukovych, bribe him, and make the deal. The guy, they can kick the guy out. And Zelensky comes in and makes all these promises. The only thing that is needed is just stop shooting. And then democracy is at work and he changes his position. It is frustrating. So I certainly found things in that essay that go beyond Solzhenitsyn or go beyond Ularov.
Can you talk a little bit about your readers? You said that writing this book was sort of an emotional and cathartic process for you to get through the first year of the war, and also indeed to explain to the general public, what the chronology of the war is, what the story of the war is. But I learned from my colleagues yesterday that the book is being translated into Ukrainian now. And so how is that?
It's also translated into French.
Into French as well.
This week.
Yeah. So how will the Ukrainian version be different? Is there a foreword that you're adding to it? How do you sort of envision those readers potentially as different from the readers of the English edition, or maybe not?
Yes, there will be no special forward to the Ukrainian translation, or for that matter to any other. And I didn't think about that anymore, and I didn't think because maybe I just I was treated by international readership too well. I remember certainly my thoughts about when Ukrainian publisher turned to me asking whether they can translate The Gates of Europe. And I reread email twice because I thought that they were asking for a different book, for a different text, because why in the world Ukraine would need, there are so many histories of Ukraine there, why they would need one more. And they translated, and it did quite well in Ukraine. And it wasn't written for the Ukrainian audience. And I guess that experience let my guard down. So now I'm not concerned about that. I don't think about that. Again, maybe I will run out of luck with this book, which is quite possible also given that we all go through the trauma of this war one way or another, but it's not the sort of experience that the Ukrainian society goes through on a daily basis. So I'm probably more worried than with my other books, but again, I'm quite negligent about those issues after The Gates of Europe worked on this using the language of publishers in different markets. Yeah.
I want to go back to your point on Zelensky and Putin's frustration about, you change leaders and the policies remain the same, even though he promised, to end the war. He only met Zelensky in person once. That was at a Paris conference, the last attempt to revive the Minsk agreement in Paris, December 2019, so 3 months before COVID. And we don't know too much about that meeting. Mikhail Zygar, in his new book, says that when Zelensky was speaking, Putin, Lavrov, and the others just even removed the headphones and didn't even listen. So you had like the dynamics. But you're right that the meeting convinced Putin actually that he had to go to war. And then 3 months later, there was COVID, so he had plenty of time, confined with his, what's the name of his buddy, Kovalyov, I think, that, indeed had to be full-scale war. But the germ, it seems to be the one time he actually met Zelensky.
Yeah. Yes, it was one of those things when you establish chronology and then suddenly discovers things that you didn't see. You actually sort of lived through them. You know about them, but your chronology is lost, and then also the relations between them is lost. Because what is happening, and then I certainly started to remember things that Zelensky comes becomes the president. The parliamentary elections happening. It's all 2019, right?
Yeah.
To be sure that chronology is right. And then there are all sorts of rumors that Zelensky and Yermak already made a deal with Kozak and others that there will be Minsk agreements on the Russian terms. And then by October, it seems to me, you have this mass movement, Ni Capitulati. And the talk is that it's the possibility of almost another Maidan, because also some government institutions on the oblast and rayon level in Western Ukraine already raising noises about maybe not doing what Kyiv wants to do. And I remember my reaction at that time, kind of always skeptical. Okay, people talk about Maidan again and again. How often do they happen? Probably not. But then basically you realize that also the position of the rhetoric or position of the Zelensky government changes. And he is meeting in December with Putin, and there are crowds in Kyiv with the Ni Capitulati. And I don't know, but my guess is that probably some promises were given early in the fall, and there were some expectations on the part of Putin and his group. And we know from the people present in Paris that Surkov out of all actually goes really ballistic. It seems to me addressing Yermak or somebody else. So something went really not according to the plan. And we know that Surkov was fired a few months after Paris meeting. So for me, it's very clear. It's very clear that something went wrong there. Again, I'm not the first one who came up with that idea. Maybe just built up the chronology more with more attention to that. But again, I'm not on Owen Matthews, it seems to me, writes there is a little bit about that.
The British journalist in Moscow who wrote a book last
right, who has
summer.
excellent sources in the Russian elite, or at least used to have. So again, I wish to say that this is my discovery, but it's more like me providing more documentation to one of the theories that was out there and that I found some support for it.
So I think this is my last question, and then we can think about opening it up for a larger discussion.
I'll have a couple, and then we'll open up.
So you wrote this book on the war. You did that. How do you move forwards? How do you think of your next project? And what is your next project?
Yeah, I tried to move forward and I failed. So it's like in US they were on the issue of the illegal immigration. We didn't cross the border crossed us. Yeah, so I didn't choose the war. The war had chosen me or chosen us to work at that. So basically, I hope to just move to other subjects, but for now, the next project will be on the war.
Can you tell us more about it?
No. It will be a very, very interesting book.
By the way, I said Kovalyev, that was Kovalchuk, the Bank of Russia fellow, so just to correct for the record. The war itself, so that's the second part of the book, the first draft of the 2022 war. I mean, you wrote until March, you said even 2023. It's mostly the events of 2022. We had this unsettling and powerful film yesterday on a medical battalion during 2022, operating in various theaters, but the first one was Hostomel. And I know you'll tell me it's out there, you know, in sources on the internet, but you provide the first very powerful narrative in book form. It's a, you know, a bulk of one chapter of the battle for Hostomel Airport, talking literally the first, second, third day, the first week of the war. That proves to be crucial and a turning point. You want to say a few words about this, again, critical moment in the early going?
Yes, Hostomel was a really critical moment, and I had a friend who basically was in Hostomel at that time through the first days. So again, we were all involved. We were following. Again, it's not like I got any particular information from there, but the information started to emerge. And here I just want to say thank you to the journalists. Right? Thank you to the journalists, because most of that stuff comes from them. They're taking this enormous risks, interviewing people. And then it's also there is something not just minuses but also pluses coming from writing at the moment. The fact is that they capture people, their emotions, their thoughts, their position at that time. And it's not like we will not find this evidence 2 years from now, 3 years from now, but we also already would have some established narrative by this author, that author, somebody else, and we'll be losing and not seeing certain things. And there is a huge danger of mistake, but there is also this opportunity to capture people in the moment. And I have there, again, it's not my interview, there are no my interviews in that book. It's for one of the journalists who interviews one of the commanders of the Ukrainian armed forces, Krasilnikov, who is saying, and this is within first maybe weeks, well, we expected the war, but we expected the war in Donbass. No one expected it here. Can you find any military commander today in Ukraine who would make that statement, who would admit that? So yeah, the Hostomel became clear quite early on, and it's something that I was trying to document as things develop. And it's also a new experience when this interview appeared. This is from the soldier's position. This is from the commander's position. Okay, here is some interrogation of the Russian soldiers, POW or something like that. And oh my gosh, I got it wrong. I'm rewriting it. I'm looking. So again, the sort of experience that you don't have is the 17th century. but with Hostomel, yes, it's a big, and it looks like the more I now collecting information, I understand that it was even bigger than I imagined when I was writing about it. It is by far the crucial battle of the war.
And finally, before we get to Igor Room, again, it was out there, and there's actually a British journalist, Andrew Harding, who wrote a small book, very, very powerful book about that little-known battle in the avalanche of information about the war. And reading your book, it was the first time that I realized, okay, this is what happened in the South. We know that the things that did not happen in the South, that the Ukrainian army failed to defend Kherson and Melitopol and Berdyansk, and basically the counteroffensive now is trying with exceedingly difficult to get back what it couldn't actually defend initially. I'm talking specifically here the South. But it's the battle of this little town named as Voznesensk.
Voznesensk.
Yeah, if you want to see a few words, because that's also a critical juncture in the war, if lesser known.
And there is a book about Voznesensk.
Yeah, Andrew Harding.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, and what happened there? The road to Odessa was blocked, really. So first it was at Mykolaiv. Russia was trying to go north to Voznesensk. They were very close to the third now nuclear power plant in Ukraine after taking over Chernobyl, after taking Zaporizhia. So the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant was within reach. And partially it was Teroborona, the territorial defense units, but also Ukrainian units that stopped that advance. That again has enormous importance, both in terms of the nuclear situation and war going literally nuclear in Ukraine with Chernobyl, Zaporizhia, and then potentially the South Ukrainian nuclear power station, but also the issue of Odessa, Ukraine's access to the Black Sea, whatever we are reading today about the Zernovy corridor, about the grain trade, all these things. So it would be a very difficult, very different situation in the South, much more difficult than it is today if that battle would go the other way.
You want to start maybe with fielding a few questions?
Yeah, so I think, why don't we take 3 questions? Yeah. So who would like to ask a question? Okay, I see Mitchell.
Hi, Mitchell Ornstein, University of Michigan. I want to ask you about war of attrition. So what a lot of people are describing the current state of the war as a war of attrition. Do you have any historical comparisons that you would compare it to World War I or anything else?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then a second question from the blue shirt right there.
Yes, hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I know you said you don't want to change anything in the book, but as the war progresses, would you be willing to publish subsequent editions with additional information on the war as the war goes on? Thank you.
Great, and do we have a third question? Yes, up here in front. Right here.
Thank you, first of all, and the book is incredibly important for many of us and the broader community in terms of setting a certain narrative and getting up in front of that. So thank you. In Lost Kingdom, you have a great section about Novgorod and Muscovy and kind of a historical kind of reference to if history had changed itself a little bit there, you might have had a different democratic trajectory in whatever Russia came into. Not a what-if question, but are there still seeds of that left in modern day or future Russia? What was there in the book?
Well, Thank you. I'll start with the last question and then move to the original two. Yeah, in this Novgorod-Muscovy confrontation and the choice between autocracy and democracy, I'm not very original. I'm just following in the footsteps of Mykola Kostomarov, the founder of modern Ukrainian National Project, who already was actually looking at that. And the question is, what if it would be a different turn? I basically don't imagine it in terms of Novgorod's victory, but I certainly imagine it in terms of the joint victory of the Novgorod and maybe Grand Duchy of Lithuania at that time, and that was a very different very different trajectory in terms of much less centralization. And certainly history could go a different way. The one battle, the battle on Shalomia, something like that, you don't win the war as a rule by winning one battle. So if the long-term war, and the war was going actually for decades, would turn the other way around, yes, but not one particular battle. In terms of Russia and Russia's future and democracy, I belong to the generation that lived through 1990 and 91 and 92, right? And that was probably the most popular religion in the world. Everyone believed that this Yeltsin on the tank, just Russia can change like that. It was also part of Solzhenitsyn's appeal that, okay, all these issues are because of communism. You remove communism and nations are naturally democratic and so on and so forth. So we now know how naive those beliefs were. So it's not that I don't believe in change. I don't believe in change overnight anymore. So that's with regard to the any sequels or what I would write differently. I actually was offered this opportunity to write a little bit differently, to correct and to add, because the paperback edition is due to appear in UK on November the 2nd. So the book is already printed in a soft cover, and the cover is very different. But other than that, actually, I didn't introduce any changes except of correcting obvious mistakes. Not because I'm particularly lazy, but I just didn't see what there would be need for change. I added 2 or 3 pages in terms of the sort of discussion of developments since February till August, really, including the Prigozhin's coup and so on and so forth. But it's really an update that really didn't change anything in the way how the book was written, or I didn't feel a need to correct anything. Well, partially that is related to the first question. Partially because also there have been no developments of major drastic changes on the front lines of the war. So the book covers the last major military operation. It's the takeover of Kherson. And since then, we have a lot of suffering, a lot of war, and basically now close to 1 year, the front lines are not moving, or at least not moving dramatically. That can change tomorrow. We certainly all hope that will happen, but it didn't change. The year started with 2 unanswered questions. First was what will happen with the Russian winter offensive, And then what will happen with the Ukrainian counteroffensive that was planned for spring really materialized in the summer. We have a very definite question regarding the first answer regarding the first question. We don't know yet about the second, but there are indications that it's quite possible that the front line will not move dramatically. The closest parallel that I have to that is World War One, right? The lines that are not moving, and the war goes on. And there can be a number of scenarios coming from World War One experience, from one of the sides running out of ammunition, like happened with the Russian army, the so-called Patronny Golod of 1915, 1916, with the direct connection to the revolution of 1917. There can be another major force appearing on the front lines, like the United States, and breaking the stalemate. So these are two things that at least the experience of World War One can suggest us. Again, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So that's what I can, as a possible parallels, examples that I can bring.
We take
Yeah,
one more round of questions.
Jesse.
Jesse.
Just a question about information warfare. Do you plan to have the book translated into Russian?
Well, it's an interesting question. So I plan, in a sense, that there is a publisher in Israel who signed a contract and even hired a translator. But I discovered someone on the Facebook wrote to me that they're discussing in their book club my book, and it is available in Russian. And they wrote, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, here is the link. It's on the web." So the book, in a pretty decent translation, exists in the free access on the web. No one asked me for permission. No
You mean
one asked
a bootleg version?
publisher for permission. Someone did the translation, not bad translation. It's not unless there are some really breakthroughs with intellectual with artificial intelligence in the last 2 months. So someone did that, and it's already out there. I think things like that happen only in the conditions of the war. So somewhere were resources, somewhere were talent to do that. I mean, human capital was invested in that. Who is behind that? I don't know. I didn't sue anybody. Didn't protest publicly or otherwise, but such thing exists.
More questions? Sophie?
Thank you very much. In terms of, I wanted to ask a question following along with translation. I'm still in the process of beginning to learn Russian. And one of the themes that my professor is always trying to impress upon the class is that you cannot directly translate so much from Russian or Ukrainian into English. And that either in the way sentences are created or sometimes the concepts as well. And I wanted to ask, in terms of giving the historical background in the beginning of your book, did you find kind of a challenge or have to think around in a creative manner how you translated central concepts to either Ukrainian identity or the history of the region to make it understandable to English-speaking or Western audience?
Thank you. It's the sorts of issues that we are talking about. I certainly encountered a lot dealing with the 16th and 17th century history, its institutions, its offices, its concepts as well. But I found it much easier with the contemporary developments, partially because what we have in Ukraine and maybe in region as a whole is basically a huge Western expansion in terms of the academic concepts, approaches, and so on and so forth. Whether this is colonialism or not colonialism, I don't know. But that's the reality. The region learned how to use concepts that existed in Western world, from English to French to other. So it's the other way around, that people there getting accustomed to those concepts and sometimes actually translate terms, sometimes don't translate terms and just borrow them. That was the major issue. So that the concepts really, internationalization in that sense happened, and again, that wasn't an issue for me. Again, when I was working on early modern history, I was struggling with that, and there were special commissions created who were trying to explain to the Western audience the Cossack state, the institutions and the concepts and everything else. Here it looks like much more internationalization. So, but thank you for this question. I actually will be conscious of it. There is an issue somewhere out there that maybe I don't recognize that it exists. Yeah.
All right. So it's been an honor. Serhii, thank you for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.